a couple of interesting debates and discussions. It's been International Week this week. I asked you, Dan, how much international football did you watch over the last week, and your answer wasn't that convincing, was it?
Well, yeah, you're totally right. Although I did turn on the England-Belgian game for about 5 minutes before the Grealish now gif that is going around the world and back, which was totally amazing. Well, yeah. And then maybe it's another thing for us to discuss generally, which is, you know, a player has one good game for England and suddenly he's a world beat. I'm not saying Grealish isn't, because actually he looks great, but suddenly everyone's calling for Gareth to build their team around Grealish now all of a sudden. So
yeah, it's funny how that can happen. I must admit, I missed that from Grealish. I watched the first half of the England game and switched off at 2-0, but we'll get onto that actually a little bit later, because international football, I think, probably does have a few issues with not really attracting the viewership, and the fact that it's been going on during a global pandemic. Premier League had a record number of cases of coronavirus today. There's probably a few kind of issues to address with international football. The one I think we wanted to touch on today was the issue of kind of player load. So we have this international break, having had a glut of Premier League, Champions League, EFL Cup, all kinds of games going on. And obviously, one of the headlines at the start of the international break was Joe Gomez having a knee injury that looks to put him out for quite a period of time. And I want to get onto the kind of legal implications, Dan, because there's been some reports around compensation, that kind of thing. So obviously Gomez is employed by Liverpool, effectively loaned out to England. So what's the kind of fallout from that for both FIFA, Liverpool, the FA, and so on?
It's a really interesting one, and it actually does have quite a lot of angles to it. But if we take one of Gomez's club colleagues, Mo Salah, I mean, it was reported a few days ago, at least, that, you know, whilst on he was international duty with Egypt, I believe, then he was filmed, I think, at his brother's wedding in pretty close proximity to everyone, and now it turns out that, at least it's reported, that he has COVID. So, you know, generally, the international break, these are the type of, I think, situations that clubs and club managers, you know, hate in a way, because even more so in COVID times, because they're completely out of control. There's pictures, I think, of I think it was Aubameyang does he play for about and the whole team just sleeping on the floor of an airport because their hotel wasn't available or whatever else it might have been. So, you know, anyway, that was just something that I came across on Twitter yesterday, but I digress. Only because, you know, what we've seen then in the last few days, obviously Liverpool's injury worries are compounded, and, you know, I can make a general disclaimer that both of us are Liverpool fans. So seeing Van Dijk sidelined for a long time, and then Gomez probably for the vast majority of the season, I think then everybody's thoughts obviously turned to Liverpool's title challenge, but then secondly, I guess, or thirdly, to the sort of financial implications of that, and the sort of general debate about compensation for injuries incurred or occur when players on international duty has actually been quite a long, drawn-out saga. If I remember correctly, I think it was after Aaron Robben, when he was at Bayern Munich in the 2010 World Cup. I think he more or less did himself quite a bad injury in one of the first games for Holland, but continued playing on against the wishes of Munich and the club doctors for Holland during that tournament. And it's only because I've just got the quote up here, I found it really interesting that Rummenigge at the time said about Robben, when you hire a car, you have to bring it back in a decent state. Robben was taken from us, then put back in the garage as a wreck. Once again, we must pay the bill as a club after a player is seriously injured playing for a national team. And I thought that was actually, you know, an interesting metaphor, but more or less served the right purpose, which was, you know, FIFA, I believe it was around 2012, had to put in place effectively a program called the FIFA Club Protection Program. And prior to that, there was no overarching FIFA insurance plan, no policy, no compensation for clubs whose players were called up and basically injured on international duty. And just to give a couple of examples, we talk about Gomez, Jack Butland, if I remember correctly, in 2016, 17, he broke his ankle against Germany when England were playing them. Stoke, who at the time in the Premier League, were able to claim a pretty handsome insurance payout to cover his wages and medical care for the period. The same with Seamus Coleman, I believe, when he did obviously quite a bad injury as well. And we can talk about some of the detail in a second. But you know, and I'm certainly not an insurance expert, but the basis of the cover, it seems to be from the FIFA documents, were that after a 28-day paid excess, a 28-day period excess amount, meaning the club can't receive compensation for the first month, the maximum wage payout is still a healthy £143,000 a week, which would cover most players, and that cover is limited to 1 year. So the maximum payout per player for the maximum period of 1 year is around £7.5 million, which is obviously a significant amount of money. Now, it's likely, I guess, I'm not quite sure Gomez will be on quite that amount of money, but even if he's on, let's just say, half of that, of around £70,000 a week, it means that Liverpool are going to get the best part of, might well be £3 or £4 million cover as a result. Now, it's only available for the 1 year, but again, that's at least some comfort, bearing in mind now, I guess, I could be completely wrong, Liverpool might have to accelerate their transfer plans to possibly buy a centre-back in the window. Maybe, Omar, we can have another Dan and Omar session on who should Liverpool be targeting in the January window, but we can maybe save that for another day.
Save that for January, yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting one because if you take every other sport, pretty much every other European team sport, the national game is the pinnacle of the game. And so you take cricket, for example, English cricket is essentially contracted. I think rugby, they're contracted by England Rugby, I think I'm right in saying. So only football is this kind of weird relationship where actually the national team is almost subservient to the club game. And I suppose, what would the view from a club be on that compensation piece? Is it like it's all we can get, or because presumably Liverpool would much rather have the money or be paying Gomez's wages and have the player fit rather than having to have this injured player on the sideline and the costs that come with that, beyond his salary.
Yeah, it's certainly better than nothing. The interesting bit is that policy, the FIFA policy, won't cover for all the variable elements. So, for example, if he had played, the particular bonuses, other types of contractual entitlements over and above what his basic guaranteed salary would be. Now, there's probably a slightly wider piece as well, which is it might be that Liverpool insure over and above what the FIFA amount might be. I don't know what Liverpool's policy might be in regard to that. It may also be that the player has separate injury insurance now. Of either significantly reducing the pay contract or actually even terminating the contract in particular ways. And their pay is being reduced accordingly. It's actually to try for the player to cover those, and at least the player might want to try and ensure again he will.
The perils of recording live. I have no idea if it's my internet or yours. I lost you for a bit there, but you're back now.
Am I back? But what bit did you not hear from? And I'll try and do it again.
A fair chunk, to be fair.
All right. I can try and recap quickly then, which was, I think the basic, just nod if I go off quickly, but I think the basic position is players need to be careful at the same time of ensuring themselves against either career-ending injury or long-term injury where they won't be receiving a large part of their contract. And, there are insurance policies available for that type of thing.
Yeah. there's a couple of good stories around. Again, you talking about how the industry's evolved actually in quite a short period of time from 2012 around the compensation for players. I think clubs have been insuring players for a little period of time now, and I think there's been quite a lot of evolution in that space. There's previously clubs used to have very kind of blanket policies on their players, but nowadays they have very kind of specific policies that are very specific to individual players. I think it's become a lot more sophisticated, that space, and I'm sure a lot more work for lawyers like yourself as well to get it right.
Let me ask you, seeing as if my reception is still pretty bad and your reception looks like it's very good, if we pivot away from, well, at least the international dimension, to the sort of player load question, because obviously a lot of managers and coaches and fans have really seen a dramatic number rise, at least, of injuries, definitely in the Premier League, 47%, at least it was a few weeks ago, of muscular injuries, etc. Debates around 5 subs, 3 subs, whatever else it might be. What sort of themes and trends are you seeing in the player load space, especially where it seems like there are games sort of going on every night at the moment, and we're looking at player load. I think we were talking about viewership load issues in a way from watching so much football.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're case in point, right, from not watching, from taking a week off from international football. Yeah, I mean, it's unquestionable that players are playing a lot more, and there's almost a little bit of an issue here of, clubs have the ability to rest their players, they have the ability to rest and rotate their players, but the issue is they don't know if their opponents are going to be resting and rotating their players, and so they feel like they have to play their full strength team every single game, and we see. All the top teams at the moment are playing pretty much their strongest teams in all the games, and that's just the nature of these coaches who want to win every single match and every single competition. Even in EFL Cup games, you're often getting. I mean, look at Spurs, for example, playing pretty strong teams in the Europa League, and seeing their backup team lose to who's in Belgium a couple of weeks ago, was kind of a marker of, well, we don't want to play that team as much anymore. So suddenly putting even more load on the top players. So that's kind of part of the issue, is that no one wants to rotate, even though there is the option to, and clubs have big enough squads now and great academies and so on. And then obviously that other big debate is around the 5 subs. So I think Klopp and Guardiola came out after that Liverpool City game a couple of weeks ago talking about the injured players on either team, and the fact that the Premier League decided not to vote through 5 substitutes. It's an issue that's kind of caused a lot of debate, not just amongst clubs but also fans, and I think it's quite an interesting one. So the big premise or the big argument against having 5 subs is that it favours essentially wealthier teams or bigger teams in the league. As someone coming at it analytically, as we do, our view as a business, certainly my view, is that it doesn't necessarily favour the bigger teams. It's something that's perhaps overstated in that respect. And so one of our data scientists, our senior data scientist on the football side, Sophie Tomlinson, wrote a really good blog back in May, which looked at the implications of having a couple of extra subs in the Premier League. And our analysis of it was that it wasn't necessarily the bigger teams that benefit from having extra subs. It's actually the teams that have better benches relative to their first team. So the easiest way to think about this, or the easiest way that I think about this, is that imagine you've got 2 teams playing each other. One of them is a team that has players that are 9 out of 10. So they're starting 11s and 9 out of 10s, and they're playing a team that has starting 11s of 6 out of 10s. Now, imagine you take out one of the 9 out of 10s and then you sub in a player who's a 7 out of 10. So an example of that last season might have been Liverpool subbing out, Salah for Divock Origi, for example. And let's say they're playing, a Crystal Palace, whose teams are majority 6 out of 10 players. And their substitute is a 5 out of 10, and they bring on at the same time. So I don't know what a good example would be, but maybe a Christian Benteke coming on for an IU up front, for example. Now, Liverpool's sub is still, so Origi is still better than Benteke, but the relative gap between the teams actually shrunk because you're downgrading Liverpool more than you're downgrading Crystal Palace, and it actually goes into how squads are kind of composed, basically. So a club like West Ham actually have quite a good, or have had historically quite a good subs bench. They've obviously spent a lot of money, so they've got a lot of kind of depth that's kind of spread into the squad. Whereas a Liverpool or a Wolves or a Sheffield United historically have invested a lot more in their starting 11. Liverpool have probably pivoted that a little bit this season. So the analytical answer is it doesn't necessarily favour big teams, and you also see that the big teams don't necessarily make more substitutions than smaller teams as well, which I think is an important point to note. The question for me, actually, and despite holding the view that it doesn't favour the big team, I'm still quite anti 5 subs from a general football point of view. From a player load point of view, it's potentially a different question. But from a sporting integrity point of view, I'm not super keen on the idea of a match starting with, let's say, 20 outfield players and almost half of those players, or half of those players potentially being different by full time. To me, that it almost feels like a different competition. I see that quite a lot in rugby nowadays, and I don't know. It's something that I like the fact that players last the 90 minutes or have to last the 90 minutes, and that's part of the sport. So yeah, there's the analytical answer, and then there's also the kind of football instinct answer, I suppose.
Just checking, can you still? Am I?
Yeah, you're on a delay, but you're still with us.
Perfect. So just another question then I had for you was, 2 things. Firstly, with the extra subs, it obviously breaks the game significantly more, and that ebb and flow of the game is different. The other thing that I found interesting was, for example, when Klopp and Guardiola were talking about substituting players and wanting the extra substitutes, that in a way, on quite a few of the games, Guardiola's actually only made 1 sub, at times Klopp's only made 1 or 2 subs in particular matches. Now, the way that I was thinking about it, at least for Klopp, not arguing that he wanted 5, was that maybe you would wait until quite late in the game sub. You would use in case of an injury, and you obviously didn't want to be down to 10 men for more of a significant period of time. But I have trouble with the argument that clubs should have 5 subs if in a lot of games they're actually only using 1 sub and then aren't substitutes that they could otherwise have. It just seems a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, if clubs aren't used, I think historically the third sub is used something like 75 to 80% of the time, so it's still not used a huge amount, and I think that's still the case at the moment in the Premier League. So teams aren't using their third sub all the time, and certain coaches almost never do. I think Roy Hodgson comes to mind, very rare user of his third sub. I think Mourinho, very rare user of his third sub. Good question from David Jacobs on, could it be good for youth players getting an opportunity in the first team? In theory, yes, but there's also an opportunity cost argument to be thought about where it comes to young players. So obviously the Premier League increased the bench last season to 9, I think it was. I don't think it's the case this season. But if you've got a bigger bench and more, in theory, opportunities to sub in young players, you might decide to then keep that player within the first team instead of loaning them out. And therefore, what you end up doing is they end up getting fewer minutes for, say, the parent club than they might otherwise get out on loan at a loan club. So that's the kind of tension that clubs have to think about. And there's all sorts of loan managers and sporting directors now who kind of have to think in depth about those things. But what can seem like a good opportunity for young players actually might not necessarily turn out to be one.
And I think the point there as well is, I guess, is for some of those younger players, just the opportunity to be able to be in the match day squad and match day experience is quite an extra experience and positive. But I can completely understand that. I mean, in sort of economics, it's almost called the counterfactual, isn't it? Is that if it hadn't been for those extra sub slots, would that player be somewhere else having more minutes and gaining greater experience in any event?
Yeah, and obviously there's a lot of discussion at the moment around these injuries and the challenges that players face at the moment. I suppose one of the kind of key things that players are thinking about is their longer term career, and the kind of implications of getting injuries. Do you see any kind of fallout from this season at the moment? Because we are going to see a lot of injuries from the game, the way the games are congested, and what sort of powers do players have to resist some of the changes? Because at the moment they're just kind of employees of the club, and if the club wants to play them, they kind of have to play.
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think partly, you look at someone like De Bruyne, for example, and his load. You know better than I, Omar, that the player welfare, player stats, the load that can be measured across the different data devices is pretty significant. So the players and the clubs will definitely know about when or otherwise they're hitting their red zones. Mm-hmm. Now, if those injury red zones are to a degree as a result of playing too often, training too much, or otherwise, you'll know better than I, and I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't know is the answer about whether this season is a complete outlier because of a truncated preseason, an extended last post-season, a shorter rest period in between, and whether it is the intensity or otherwise of not being in front of fans. I'm not entirely sure. So from a player welfare perspective, I can only speak for whenever I talk with players and their teams around them. Generally, is they're just happy to play football, is the truth. I know it sounds like a really basic, simple suggestion, and obviously the analytics and stats guys will obviously tell them particular loads are getting into extreme situations. But a lot of the reason Klopp would have argued his sort of success of those rotation of those middle three midfielders who cover a lot of ground is because they have to rotate because of the physical load that attaches to those running positions. Whereas you don't need to, obviously, I'm telling you to suck eggs now, you don't obviously need to quite rotate centre backs as much, or a goalkeeper or other players as a result. So I'm just fascinated to try and understand how and why there has been this increase in injury rate, whether it's actually either managers feeling they need to get a very good start to the season and not rotating as much, whether it's all in the preparation, whether it's the intensity or otherwise of the matches. Do you have any sort of initial feel points as yet?
Yeah, it's kind of perfect storm of factors, I think, at the moment with what you said around the shortened pre-season and no competition was willing to give an inch. The EFL Cup was, in a way, the obvious potential casualty of the calendar, because we're the only country, I think, that has a League Cup. France has scrapped its League Cup, so we're the only country now with a League Cup. So it could have been an obvious one to go, but the EFL Cup also brings in a lot of TV revenue for the EFL, so it's it has to stay on the calendar for the sake of the EFL teams. And you look at what else can go. Well, the FA Cup's not going to go. I think we might have scrapped replays this year, but I'm not certain. Obviously the European competitions are going to stay, so no one was willing to give an inch. That means it is weekend midweek for every single club, regardless of what level you're at. And when it comes to assessing injuries, clubs have access to all kinds of sports science, medical information now. But I think a lot would be willing to admit that it's as much art as science when it comes to predicting injuries. There's so much data, but injuries are so random. It's a bit like, predicting, I don't know, a player when he's stepping up to take a penalty. You think he's going to score, but he might miss, and you're not really sure when it's going to happen. And it's a bit like that with injuries. A player might be hitting a certain red zone, but sometimes he gets through it fine, sometimes he doesn't. And because when I've seen injury data before, teams have injuries during a season, but it's not like hundreds that you can begin to create models that predict them. It's in maybe a couple of dozen, and so that couple of dozen could be impact, it could be load, it could be sprinting too, it could be any number of factors. And so I think clubs are having to push their players, for the reasons we discussed around they want to win every game, they want to compete for all the trophies, and that's causing these pressures. And I'm sure, we've not got a winter break this season. It'll be really interesting to see what happens with, like, for example, Bundesliga teams that do have a winter break. I assume this season, albeit a shortened one. I'm sure they will be in a very good position when it comes to the Champions League knockout stages.
Just one more point then for you. And again, sorry to put you on the spot, but it just sort of got me thinking in terms of when you were sort of explaining really nicely about the 5-sub rule and why it actually doesn't necessarily benefit the bigger clubs, which is, when we're talking about, I've completely lost the chain of what I was going to say. Have me for a second. It was when we were talking about, a competitive balance. That's what I was going into. When we're talking about then injuries taking their toll as a result, and then the deeper squads being needed in order to be able to cope. If injuries are occurring to the top clubs and some of the top players in those clubs, does that effectively equalize the playing field to a degree? And if it does that mean that actually we're more likely to see a closer title race, a closer race for top European positions and vice versa?
Yeah, I think that could very well be the case. These teams competing in the UCC, UEFA competitions, competing, with intensity in Premier League matches, can't really rest players. If you're a bottom half team, if you're, I don't know, Burnley and you've got Chelsea away on the weekend, you might decide you want to rest players for that game. Whereas, Man City, are they really going to risk it? If you look at the points totals that won Premier League titles over the last few years, are they really going to risk resting players at Burnley away or Burnley at home? So I think there is a potential that it might. I mean, we've already seen this season the league table feels kind of upside down to a degree, and in a way that's a good thing. That's what keeps entertaining. So could well be the case. I just noticed a couple of questions here on the screen. So, do you think the later stages of the Premier League and Championship, the 5 subs will be much more needed, factor in the load of the games? I think one of the issues you have, particularly if you implemented that in the Premier League, is kind of a sporting integrity issue. Because if, I don't know, Liverpool didn't have access to 5 subs at Man City away, or Man City didn't have access to 5 subs against Liverpool at home, but then did in the away game, there's a bit of a kind of imbalance there. That I think to me, it feels unlikely that they'd implement the rule. I think that's maybe slightly different with the Champions League if we got to knockout stage. I mean, in the same way that we had it, I guess, last year to a degree. Although I suppose in the Premier League we did as well, but it was kind of exceptional circumstances. So I think there'll be a reluctance on that ground, even if the effect isn't huge. The perception of the effect, I think, might be.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it would be difficult to be able to implement a rule change which has potentially significant on-field performance-related matters. It's sort of that becomes a bit of an issue. Although, to be fair, I mean, I know maybe we're going completely off topic here, but the Stockley Park's new interpretation of the handball rule for VAR decisions, that's a change to what was supposedly the case, even though query how consistent that's been in the last couple of weeks. So, in a way, everything is relative, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like playing Monopoly and changing the rules as you go along. Like, everyone kind of just goes with it. They just so it's better for everyone. So that might be the outcome.
We're at 50, mate. It's flown by. It's probably been better that my reception hasn't been good, so you haven't had to listen to my drone for longer than usual.
That's right. Well, we'll edit it out on the podcast. It'll be seamless.
Wicked. Well, for everybody either watching live or otherwise on the YouTube or on the podcast, thanks very much for joining as always. Omar, do you want to tell everyone where they can find you and follow you, etc., as usual?
Yeah, at Omar Chowdhury on Twitter. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn as well. And yeah, obviously a lot of the content going out through Dan's channels on the podcast and YouTube, LinkedIn and Twitter and Instagram. So whenever you want to tune in, obviously go through Dan's channels.
Hopefully we'll get some of your channels going as well soon. I think I'm getting a bit selfish of putting them on mine, so we'll make a change sooner or later, I promise. Take care. Thanks, pal.